talk,
identity,
and access
management.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How's it going?
Good. Today is a special day.
I'm excited.
Yep. We also have a special guest. She is Eve Mailer, ForgeRock's Chief Technology Officer and Chief Humanitarian. Welcome to the show, Eve.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Chief Humanitarian. That means I just founded and still run the User Managed Access work group at Kantara.
That's pretty cool. How did that come about? Because that's been around for a little while, right?
Has been around for a little while. Actually, the Kantara organization was new when we started User Managed Access. And it was, UMA actually started at the Internet Identity Workshop, IIW, when OAuth was newish. And we were looking for, how to give people control over their own data. And now we'd probably talk a lot more about privacy. Privacy is actually kind of cool and hip these days. Maybe it wasn't so much then, but I'm glad it is now. But UMA is now at version 2, like OAuth is at version 2, and it actually is built on top of OAuth 2. So there you go.
So to educate our listeners, what is the difference between OAuth and UMA or UMA?
Yeah, so OAuth helps people share access to their services with applications that they themselves use. That's a way to think about it. UMA actually goes a little bit farther. It builds on top of that capability of OAuth. It helps people share access to those services to not just applications they themselves use, but to other people in their lives. That's its main use case. So we like to say it's for Alice to Bob sharing. So I'm like looking at a screen now and I've got Google Docs up and there's a share button up in the corner. And I use things like, I don't know, TripIt. Well, I used to use things like TripIt back when I used to travel.
Right, back in the day.
Right. But, there's a lot of apps and services that have this capability to let you delegate access to other people, other parties in a constrained way to the stuff that you can do at those services, to the data at those services, even to like IoT devices. And each one of them has to actually implement that functionality itself. And UMA actually makes it easy in a standardized way, leveraging OAuth and actually leveraging OpenID Connect and things like that, to build that functionality into those services. And it actually makes it possible to build a kind of a dashboard or control console in a single place with a single service that you're using the kind of OAuth authorization server concept to control lots of different services where all of your data and your stuff lives. Without having to aggregate it into that one place. So it's kind of, hopefully a convenience for people. And it leverages the stuff we have, so to speak, lying around the house, OAuth and OpenID Connect and stuff.
Yeah, and I feel like it's so cool. And you brought up privacy, just the idea that, in like, say, a healthcare use case, I as a patient could give someone access to some things and not other things. And I could use a web interface to do that. You can build around all these standards and services. And I don't know, to me, that's what the market's demanding now, is more control over our privacy. It's really big in Europe and maybe as Americans it's just starting to enter the conscience for more and more people. But it's a growing movement, if you will. People want to have control over their privacy, and they worry about all their private information just going everywhere, and big companies having access to it and reselling it, and then you lose control over it.
Yeah, it's funny, sometimes humanitarians talk about this positive vision of privacy that we've been trying to achieve. It's sort of like, sometimes the regulations are just trying to treat people as passive, victims or passive people around which, data controllers and data processors are supposed to do things. But the positive vision of privacy is that you get to actually control your destiny. And so that's kind of the share button version. You get to hit a button that lets you control and configure what you want to have happen without somebody's external influence on you, that kind of opt-in consent kind of version of privacy. So we sometimes like to say that it's about selective sharing. So that's the positive vision. And so in fact, at ForgeRock, we are actually working with a healthcare customer to implement what you were just talking about in terms of sharing kind of a bundle of different kinds of health-related resources, different sets of data from different places. So somebody who's a customer, a patient or a health insurance member could share out to, say, a spouse that data. And then let's say that person that you've shared with isn't your spouse anymore, which can happen. You want to be sure that you can sort of unshare all of those feeds of information, if you will, because it's information that differs over time. You can unshare it all at once, no matter where it lived. And you had your reasons for wanting to do that. And then the health insurer has their own reasons as well for wanting to make sure that it's all undone properly, auditing reasons, compliance reasons, like that.
So, Eve, I've been wondering this. So as the chief evangelist,
oh, I've never actually heard that before.
There you go.
Good one, Jim.
Thanks, guys. No, but as the chief evangelist for a standard, what have you learned about kind of getting momentum behind that? And I would imagine, well, maybe you just tell us, what is your vision for how big and how universal UMA gets, or is it more fit for purpose? And then what have you learned along the way about kind of getting it out there and getting it to be, to mold into that vision?
Well, it's funny, I've done a lot of standards in my time. I've been, XML girl, right? So, I was involved in XML. I've been involved in a lot of standards. And what you want to do is, solve for the right problem. And what's really nice is when sometimes what you've standardized can get sedimented into other standards, actually. You want to know that it's just sort of even piece parts are being used. And that's something that UMA has actually had some success at. So you may have used, and a lot of the people listening to this may have used dynamic client registration in OAuth. And the folks at the UMA table actually kind of needed that functionality a long time ago and put together a modular spec around dynamic client registration. And that got sedimented into OAuth a long time ago. And we said, hey, that's great. A wider audience needed that. We're happy to have those guys do it. And so that was a success. That was a success story of UMA. And there's some other pieces as well that we started work on, and it turned out a wider community needed it. So it could be that lots of things get sedimented into other places over time, and we'd be thrilled with that.
Yeah, I think it's smart to treat standards like Lego bricks, right? Trying to build out different components. Because if you try to do too much with one thing, it's never going to be great at any particular thing, right? It's more of a jack of all trades. So, but if you're able to weave in interoperability and layers where you're able to stack standards, I think that makes a ton of sense.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So yeah.
So you mentioned XML. And I know you've been in an IAM space for a long time, and one of the first questions we totally went right into it this time is that we like to ask folks is how did you get into IAM, and maybe you can share a little bit about how did you fall into the wonderful world of IAM, or did you select it?
I got pulled in in the year 2000. I got pulled in when it was sort of time. I guess the time had come to solve cross-domain single sign-on. So I was at Sun Microsystems. We had a partner in Integrity that had written a spec, and they were sort of draft calling it SSML, I think, Security Services Markup Language. And I really recommended, that's not sexy enough a name. Can you please call it S2ML, which they did. I like that better. And then there was this sort of competing spec out there created by a company called Securant. And it was called Auth XML, AUTH XML. And there was this sort of idea that, hey, these two smallish companies really got to sort of put these things together and make a merge spec out of them and solve this problem together. And I recommended that they take the specs to Oasis, which was the kind of not newly formed .org, but it was the newly renamed .org that was SGML Open. Now that XML was a thing, that we're going to call it XML Open. They changed it to Oasis. We know Oasis now. And there were a bunch of folks in the industry that were just encouraging this to happen. And eventually we formed the Security Services Technical Committee. And eventually the thing that got created was called SAML. I was the lone XML geek in a room full of LDAP and single sign-on geeks, PAM geeks, whatever, in 2000, 2001. And that's where I met folks like, I don't know, Bob Blakely, Jeff Hodges, Bob Morgan, the lovely Bob Morgan, Heather Hinton, Phil Hallen-Baker, lots and lots of folks who are just, industry folks who are awesome. And, we got into a room in early 2001, and I was sort of designated to become the first chair for various political reasons, because I was sort of neutral. And I think it was because I didn't know anything about that world, actually. And I was like, okay, everybody introduce yourselves. We're going to get to know each other. And they're like, look, we know each other already. Who are you? And that was my introduction. So I learned all kinds of stuff, and I was there to kind of help everybody figure out the schemas for SAML and get them right. So that's what happened.
And thus XML Girl was born.
Oh, XML Girl was born actually in 1996 or 7. I mean, I was working on the XML spec, back when, I helped, create XML. I got the tag XML Girl while I was on a Caribbean cruise, and, they had a new business center with internet access. And they're like, hey, you want to send mail to somebody? Create a Yahoo account. And I'm like, oh, what should I call it? And XML was, we were in the process of defining XML. So that was 97 or so. I was in Nassau.
That's a pretty fun cruise.
It was awesome. I mean, what a geeky thing to do, right?
No, but I like how humble you are. You kind of just, this was the meeting where SAML got started. I think I've heard of SAML. I think it's something that all of our listeners have heard of as well. So good on you, Eve.
It's
almost like sitting in the room. We're like, oh yeah, that's where the Declaration of Independence was drafted up. It's like the IAM version of that.
Well, what I'm pleased about is, it's the graybeard now, right? It's really old. And I know that a lot of people think it's, so difficult to use. And it's kind of this gaseous data format and whatever. But I know that it's still pretty well used, right? By business SaaS and everything. And I'm pleased that it's kind of, whatever stood the test of time. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, very little less forever.
At some point, I'm sure there will be revisions to it, right? We've seen OAuth go to OAuth 2 and different versions of different things. What do you think is the next big thing in the IAM space?
Oh, gosh. I thought hard, knowing you were going to ask me this. And, there's lots of things that can happen. Lots of things I think will happen. I tried to pick something that is important to me. And there's one big thing that I think is going to happen that affects especially consumer IAM, but will affect all of IAM. I think that consent, as conceived of today, is in big trouble. As my nephew, when he was very, very young, would have said is in big trouble. We need to actually really remake consent in authorizations image. We've talked a little bit about UMA, and that's kind of one of the visions of it that I have. We can see that consent is in trouble. There's some research that I published with a woman named Lisa Lavasher through an IEEE journal pretty recently about this. The way that consent is conceived of regulatorily and also experientially is this, the consent seeker in a digital context when you're being asked for your personal information, but also in real life, is the consent seeker asks you for something. They kind of have the upper hand always. It's just the nature of the relationship. And you pretty much feel like you have to give in because you're just at the cusp of using the service. You don't have a good way to negotiate most of the time. And there aren't really good ways to revoke your consent. I mean, at the margin, things can be different, but in the main, it's not an even relationship. So they're pulling consent from you. And so in our research, we looked at, sort of other ways that you could do things. And we came up with this notion of right to use licensing. Other people have come up with this notion too. But we looked at the criteria for what you'd have to do to change things. And I just think that, consent, ForgeRock implements consent management. We do a really good job of it. We have this kind of unified single pane of glass interface, but we're seeing the way the future's going. And it isn't just, you can't just do a great job of consent management the way it's conceived of today, opt in and opt out. It's failing people. They don't trust services, it's clear. Services that can get away with a bad job of it are doing it. And I encourage you to go take a look at dark patterns, like the Twitter feed, dark patterns, or the website for some really egregious examples of bad faith consent flows. Sites and services can get away with that stuff because, it's possible, even with GDPR being in enforcement for 2 years and so on, even with CCPA, which obviously they're trying to fix, but I don't think it's going to work. So what happens? I think they're going to start to realize that you can't just throw regulations at that model forever. And I think we need to put people sort of in charge of what it is they want done. And you have to put that in front of even authentication. It's the only way we could see to do it. And that,
Eva, yeah. I mean, I think this is an example of what I'm seeing out there is kind of a bad pattern that you see over and over again every time you go to a website. It's, the alert, we use cookies. I mean, this could be almost each and every website. It's the exact same thing. And you just click OK and get out of here. Of course. I mean, if you didn't, you wouldn't be able to use any websites, for example.
Yep.
So to me, that's a bad pattern. And also that, privacy policies, it's just fine print. And you have to accept them before you use any websites, rather than the requirement getting to the point where actually we are able to tell you what our privacy policy is in 5 sentences. And I actually might read 5 sentences if I care about my privacy, but I'm not going to spend 2 hours reading, all the fine print when I need to pay my utility bill or something online. And you really have me as, I really don't have much choice, especially if I want to pay my utility bill and I don't want to have my power shut off. I'm kind of a captive. So I wonder what your thoughts are there.
It's absolutely right. And, we're not the first ones to analyze this. Actually, one of the things we point to in the research is there's some famous research where they sort of had a fictitious social network and with some terms and conditions they asked people to look at. And there's some standards for how long it takes to read stuff like terms and conditions. And it would have taken many minutes to read the terms and conditions and the privacy policy in this case. And people were spending, maybe 90 seconds. I can't remember exactly how long to read this stuff. And they were basically skimming over it and mostly, like 97% of the time, agreeing. And missing the fact that there were sort of Easter eggs in these contracts. And they were agreeing to the contracts. It's called consent to contract. So it's kind of consent. And the Easter eggs were like, you are agreeing to give your firstborn to the service and that the NSA can read all your data.
Yep. Or you sell your soul. I've seen that one.
Yeah.
Right. The corporation owns your soul now.
Yeah, exactly. It's proof that it doesn't work. I mean, it's proof that we're just kidding ourselves. Yeah. So like, if you really want the situation to be better, you gotta change up something. And the cookie consent gets so much attention actually, because it's the very first time you meet a service. So you have to get ahead of even wanting the cookie. And now GDPR is sort of saying, well, our interpretation of the rules is you can't even have those cookies. And it's like, really? Okay. So you just went to all that trouble. So we could have just started with that assumption. So yeah, totally agree.
So consent is the big thing. I thought you were going to say blockchain.
Well, let's get to blockchain if you like.
So we were chatting a little bit before we, hit the record button a few days ago. And, I think the question I asked was, is blockchain identity overhyped? And then you turned it around to me and you said, well, what do you think? So to recap it, here's what I said. And then I'd be curious to see what you say. I don't know if it's overhyped or not, because I don't think it's there yet. I see blockchain as a potential option for consumers, people who are citizens, maybe interacting with government services. I see some interplay with privacy and consent and being able to, revoke things maybe based along that line. Finance, healthcare, education, maybe all have some play there. But I do not see blockchain identity happening inside of an organization's firewall, right? I don't see it replacing Active Directory, at least anytime soon for companies. So that's my hot take on it. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to define my terms, first of all. Blockchain identity. I'm going to read that as roughly what some people will be willing to call self-sovereign identity, SSI, or decentralized identity. So I'm just going to shorthand it as SSI and maybe not let it stand for anything, just SSI. So I don't necessarily mean some identity system that has incidental blockchain somewhere in it. I mean, the thing that intends to have these properties of, bring your own identity using some of these standards involved in them. Things like, DIDs and VCs, decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials, all that stuff. Short answer is, I do think it's overhyped. Yeah, I do. That said, I mean, ForgeRock is actually doing quite a lot of investigation around, being able to issue credentials and verify credentials and, integrate with application backends that, IT knows and loves. Absolutely. So we'll be prepared if somebody wants to do that. No question. But there's a lot of hard challenges here. And I mean, potentially not intractable challenges, but I've seen this movie, back when we called it user-centric identity. And I knew that situation extremely well. I was there, right? One of the things I see is the people who are involved deeply in doing a lot of these things tend to be IDP type people, issuers who have what they perceive to be valuable credentials. And I saw the same thing before when it was, hey, we've got a lot of valuable data and if we build it, they will come. And that meant relying parties. And so if you take issuers to be sort of approximately equivalent to IDPs and, verifiers, hopefully verifiers will be approximately, well, they are relying parties. They rely on others to do some work for them. You have to make systems that have little enough friction for relying parties to actually go to all this trouble, because it's a lot of technology. It's a lot of technology. It's a lot of decryption. It's a lot of work to put into place to get some attributes. Okay, to a first approximation attributes. There's other stuff I know. So that's one big question. Like if we recall, OpenID Connect, when they were putting it together, those folks put a lot of testing together to ensure that relying parties would actually use OpenID Connect before they finalized it. And finally, after a year of testing, 2014, OpenID Connect 1.0 was born. But relying parties are the hardest audience to satisfy. So until there's a lot of sort of robust relying parties, verifiers going, I'm willing to really absorb these verifiable credentials, I don't think it's a done deal at all. Second thing that's a hard challenge is interoperability of wallets. I'm seeing deliberately, not just inadvertent interoperability problems of wallets that only handle some credentials. I'm seeing deliberate walled gardens of wallets. And if it's deliberate, you can't get over that. There's a business reason for it.
Right. It's almost like the next land rush is which network is going to become the next one.
Yeah. And akin to that is we're seeing what Gartner calls blockchain consortia, which is basically circles of blockchain network trust. And it's no different from federations as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it's almost exactly the same.
Yeah. I mean,
it's just a heavier or maybe more secure technology behind it, but it's absolutely federation. And this is my challenge with it is that I think you made a great point, Eve, is like there's a lot of technology behind this. So that means you have to be at a certain scale in order for it to be feasible. We talked about kind of networks based on university systems or healthcare systems, or they may be large enough that it would make sense and that the level of affiliation of the users is strong enough. But then, I and Jeff revealed we had this conversation the other day, so I've had some time to think about it, because my feeling was most of the universities and healthcare organizations that I've worked with, they've got bigger fish to fry, right? Rather than trying to, be the identity provider around their system. So they're trying to solve more near and dear problems. Then I thought about governments, and then I with all that's going on in the world today, probably is also putting this in my mind. It's like, there has to be a level of trust for this to even be worth it. One of the things that I find is like there are some huge identity providers out there with Facebook and Google, and most of the clients that I work with, they're only going to use those for low risk use cases because the level of trust there, almost from a technology side, but just from the standpoint of like, are you doing your due diligence that we want to do to make sure that who the person is who they say they are? We just don't have that level of trust. And I really don't think that wholesale people are going to adopt governments doing that either. Maybe before Google and Facebook, but still, I don't feel like it's a near and dear ready to happen tomorrow.
Here's the criteria. I think, it has to provide sufficient convenience and sufficient value for whatever friction that it's imposing. I mean, that's true of anything, right? So an old friend of mine used to say many years ago about enterprise software, it's expensive, but it's hard to use. So, if you've got something that, is a big bolus of software that everybody has to implement, and it provides, either a bad experience or, a lot of hassle or whatever, it has to provide a lot of value if you're going to go to that bother. And I don't quite see yet that it's enough value. And maybe it'll get there, but given the fact that we're seeing deliberate kind of barriers to huge amounts of interoperability so that it becomes really bring your own identity, I'm distrustful kind of that the business value is really going to bring that wonderful land that the pictures paint.
Sounds like we're on the same page. I feel like the same things, that value prop just isn't there yet, and keep waiting, and I don't know if they'll ever make it in time for the next big thing.
That's interesting. Oh, the next wave. I don't know what that will
right.
be. Now that we said blockchain, by the way, we have to use my blockchain drinking game, which is every time you say blockchain, we have to drink. So now we're like 17
done. It's happy hour somewhere.
That's right.
Hey, Jeff, I do want to throw out there that if anybody is sitting there and steam is coming out of their ears and wants to make the opposite case, contact us and we'd love to have them on the show.
Yeah. Cool. The great thing about opinions is they can change. So that's the way that those work. I know that ForgeRock just put out a report recently called the Consumer Identity Breach Report, and we had a chance to scan through it and kind of pick out some of the things that I thought were interesting. I thought maybe we could pivot to maybe talk about that report, if that's okay.
Absolutely. And I'm sure somebody's going to listen to this and say, well, of course, once the data is all in everybody's wallets, it'll be so much more secure and then it'll solve everything. It's like, okay, well, let's put all of the infrastructure in all the places and it'll work.
Right. And you know, it doesn't, you don't have to worry about a cost. Everything's just free. It works. There's no ops. Right. Yeah, it is what it is. I try to pick out some of the things that I thought were interesting, and I'm sure Jim did as well. And I'm going to go first because that's just the way it works. Right. The statement that I want to put out there, and I pulled this report, is the cost of a breach in the US increased 112% to $8.19 million in 2019, which is up from 3.86, which is a huge increase. I mean, more than double, right? Yeah. You know, why do you think that is? Is it just because there's more records? Is it more significant records, or maybe a combination of both, or something else?
So, I mean, this is, I think it was probably because there's so many more digital transformation imperatives and the hunger for data is greater, plus compliance costs. You take that into account along with generally poor access management practices that are just, you know, endemic. And it's why I've been saying that, you know, when it comes to data breaches, the biggest cybersecurity problem on the internet is an identity problem, because, you know, 40% last year of the data breaches were caused by unauthorized access. So taken all together, it's just, you know, the hunger for getting more data to execute to all these awesome things that you can do with the data. And it isn't always just, you know, it's the sort of second order things that you can do with data and all of the new devices that generate data and things like that. That's all digital transformation generated.
Yeah, that's a lot of data being generated when you think about it, right? IoT, watches, phones, everything is generating data now, and there's just so much more of it. It always puzzles me that, you know, we keep hearing breaches going up, costs of breach going up, and yet organizations still struggle with IAM. You know, in a lot of ways, whether it's, you know, not really having a good understanding of who has access to what. When you think about it from an identity governance perspective, you know, too many accounts, they're not really leveraging things like single sign-on. You know, we see companies out there that still aren't using MFA. I mean, and it's not just enterprises, right? It's consumer-facing applications that don't support MFA. They're just not doing a good job with it. And
yep, it's true. It's true.
The risk is just crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that organizations that are waiting and kind of just sitting on their hands or maybe aren't aware. You know, I think sometimes when it comes to consumer identity and access management, you know, there's a lot of companies where one branch, one division, one business unit did something expedient because they had business to get done. And then some other business unit did the same thing for the same reason, completely differently, because they had business to get done. And then that happened 37 times, right? Mm-hmm. And then it's not that they're waiting to invest, it's that they don't realize how many kind of silos they actually have and how it's hurting their business. So in the case of SIAM, it's just that they're kind of like 37 businesses, and it's hurting them because suddenly you don't realize how much upsell and cross-sell you could be doing if you actually had a single picture of the customer, a single view of the customer, and then how much better you'd look if they had a single view of you.
Exactly.
Because you look like 37 companies to them.
Right. Yeah. I think I see that quite a bit in the finance industry. Finance and insurance tend to have silos that operate, right? You've got life insurance, car insurance, rent insurance. And sometimes those operate as different businesses, and they do think tactically, right? They're solving their problem, but they're not solving bigger problems.
Yeah, they just make decisions that end up hurting them. And then the same is actually true when it comes to like employee single sign-on. And, single sign-on actually means two completely different things when it comes to, employees and consumers. But it turns out that the way you solve the problems can actually look very similar. And you want to have the same awesome experience and efficient experience when it comes to authentication and authorization for both of them. You want to have an awesome journey that can be, designed and changed and, optimized for each of them. We actually have on ForgeRock's site, we have these ROI calculators. So you can actually see how much money you're wasting if you don't do IAM.
If you need to ruin your day.
It's like, actually, no, I mean, it's like if you want to look like a hero to your boss, it's like, you could save $10 million if you just put this in place. It's like, I could, what? Come here with me and I'll let you meet, meet the whoever, CIO, or, could be the chief digital officer, right? I mean, there's a lot of CDOs that we're working with. So it's kind of cool. So that's what modern IAM can do for you now.
So, Eve, we did a podcast a couple weeks ago. The Verizon data breach report came out, and it was showing a big trend in the direction of phishing attacks as kind of the prevalent form of how data breaches get started. You kind of found the same thing in your report. I think it was 14% of all breaches.
Yeah, it's increasing. In fact, so it was increasing to number 3 we saw in 2019, and in the first quarter of 2020 it was increasing to number 2. So we were seeing the same trend. It was still sort of a distant number 2 in our numbers, but yeah, it's definitely increasing. And to improve that, you obviously, you're saying that you see people not deploying second factors and things like that, but to improve that, the onus is on companies to improve the journeys that they're putting their customers through and their users through. And it's just, it's kind of crazy what they're putting people through.
Oh yeah. I mean, and the phishing attacks are just getting better and better. I got one in my email today. It was, posed as Netflix, and my credit card needed to be re-entered, of course. And the thing was, the way it was worded was, your credit card has expired. And I had a credit card recently expire. And so on several websites, this was actually happening in my life. I'm assuming everybody goes through this, every, couple of years, you have one of your credit cards expire, and it kind of daisy chains through whatever services. So, but I looked at it, I was like, I just would never, I just have because of the industry I'm in, I will not allow myself to fall for a phishing stunt. And, I like clicking on just to see what it routes me through. And it was totally a phishing campaign, but it was that good.
I'll tell you what, I just, I was at the hairdresser, and the person was telling me how they keep getting phishing attempts and she knew what phishing was, and she keeps getting them from what purports to be Apple telling her that, that her password was stolen. And she knows very well that it's not true, because she just, went and updated an app or whatever. And she's very cognizant of the fact that this is going on. I was like, good for you. Because I was explaining to her, what I do. And I think that there's a higher level of awareness. And also, I'm a little surprised that there isn't more use, apparently, of DKIM, right? To bat this down. But as well, I think that it's possible to design more adaptive authentication journeys for people to combat this better. It shouldn't be hard to do. We take an approach at ForgeRock where it's like an admin can actually just sort of drag and drop, kind of like it's kind of branched logic and authentication trees. And you could do things like design honeypots for some suspected cyber criminal. And then we do it, we call it sort of putting your known user on an express lane so that they get a great experience.
Right.
And then, make the bad guy jump through hoops. And then that way you can start to actually get this much more adaptive way of behaving. But it takes a little bit of design on the admin's part. And then as you discover through whatever A/B testing that, for an under $5 purchase, we kind of don't care about, that much, we're losing a little bit of money, but you can sort of optimize your business goals.
I think it makes a lot of sense. I don't think organizations typically take that approach. Again, I think they're thinking, tactically. But it is what it is, I guess, until it gets better. The one of the areas and businesses that I thought are maybe verticals would probably be the right word that seems to struggle quite a bit with IAM is healthcare. Mm-hmm. They were a big target, and they continue to be the biggest target. It seems like for everyone going after them. But at the same time, it seems that a lot of healthcare organizations don't really invest as much as they probably should be into their IAM infrastructure, whether it's internal, external, et cetera.
Yeah.
Well, I think, what's something that if you're in the healthcare field and you're listening to this, how do they get better at that? How does someone make the case to someone who does control the budget to say, this is something that we really need to take seriously?
Well, healthcare is getting more digital, obviously, in the current environment. You can have, at this point, we've had incidences of where you have to 100% kind of remote onboard somebody. There's been people who conduct doctor visits 100% remote. So you start having a situation where healthcare is acting a lot more like other industries than they might have used to, even though they deal in data that's hugely valuable because the records contain a lot of, sort of physical data and digital data. And it can be used for things like prescription fraud, medical identity theft things. So the consequences are higher. The data is sort of more voluminous, but they're starting to act in 100% digital ways where they kind of didn't necessarily used to. So it just cranks up the importance of everything they do. So, maybe they should be looking at the ROI calculator themselves. I mean, the techniques are oftentimes the same. Now, they do have a lot of regulatory needs that are different. So like the patient matching type of things where there's some different infrastructure that they sort of have to hook up to. And there was recently an ONC virtual testimony day. I was just about to catch up with that online to see what they were saying about that. So I would say that largely they really just need to start doing the best practices that a lot of folks have known from the rest of the other industries. And I've also advocated in other forums that they can learn a lot from looking at financial services, which have some similar challenges and have been largely digital, and also handle things like cross-border challenges really well because they've had to. So maybe that's a piece of advice that could be useful.
Yeah, that's a great model to follow. The finance industry, they've certainly not defeated it, but they've certainly invested a lot in trying to figure out some of these issues.
That's right.
I know our time is running short here, and I've only got a couple more questions we want to get to. Before we wrap up on the report, do you think that the pandemic situation is going to help improve healthcare's approach to IAM investments? Or do you think it's just, they see it as just a blip and it's really not going to affect their timelines for maturity in that space?
It's forcing a conversation for sure. It's put a spotlight on the whole area. It's probably, I'm seeing that it's delaying some of the regulatory imperatives in some areas that, I've been hoping it'll force a conversation around. Like, so it's unlocking some sort of provider to provider data sharing, I think. Maybe that's not, well, that's maybe for a good cause, but it's maybe sort of not the right kind when you're thinking about, patient-centric data sharing. So I worry a bit about, privacy centricity, worrying about focusing on permission and consents and things. So I think they're going to start going down to first principles for a little while, which is maybe good. But I hope that they expand their view, the entire industry expands its view once again to look at some of the things that have been, it was an imperative pretty recently around the new rules, the new CMS and ONC rules, things around like, patient-centric health data sharing and delegation. That's near and dear to my heart. It's something that everybody wants to be able to do. You need access to your own data. And then once you access it, well, that's nice, but you want to be able to share it out at your own discretion for things like getting a second opinion or sharing it with, caregivers in your home and your family members. It's like, it's not useful otherwise. So I hope that the pandemic situation won't delay or prevent healthcare IAM investments of all sorts.
Yeah, my biggest concern for healthcare is I think that they had to disallow elective procedures for so long. And I think that's a major source of income for most hospitals. And they're just going to feel the budget pinch. I mean, it's not that security or privacy has become less important. If anything, it's become more important. However, they're going to have to get by in these tough times. That's my not so optimistic view of the world, I guess.
It's a really good point. I mean, I think that was an unintended consequence of this whole sort of stay home thing. I don't think that they thought about the whole elective procedure, discretionary part of healthcare and healthcare being a business. So that's unfortunate.
I guess it depends where you're in the world, but in the US, at least it's a business. That's for
sure.
Yes,
that's right. That's right.
All right. So let's start to wrap things up here because I know that, we want to be respectful of time. I forgot to mention this before, but the Identiverse conference starts next week or today, if you're listening to this on when we plan on publishing it. Are you going to be attending or presenting anything this year?
Yeah, I certainly hope to attend as much of it as possible. I will be moderating a panel on next-gen authorization. It's not your grandfather's OAuth, with 4 distinguished panelists. Very excited about that. That'll be, I think that's a little bit later on in the Identiverse proceedings. But I was, for the first time, a content committee person and helped sort of shuffle along a lot of authorization content. And I'm very excited to have helped bring that to people, and that'll start to appear shortly. So I'm excited about Identiverse. I'm only just sad that ZZ Auth can't play Identiverse this year.
I was going to ask you about ZZ Auth. So for the folks who don't know, what is ZZ Auth?
ZZ Auth and the Love Tokens is a band with slightly varying members over the years that started playing Identiverse, I guess it was 4 years ago now. We've played 3 times at Identiverse. And we played, 3 or so other gigs. And, it's a bunch of identity-centric musicians. And, we're a good time cover band. And gosh, I formed it with, I formed it with Vic Lanzelotti first and foremost, but we found folks like Alex Weinert and Pam Dingle and Curtis Cray, Barry Sadamond, and we grew and grew. We got better and better, I hope. We found folks like Justin Richer, and I think we had 10 folks in it last time we played, and we were at the museum in DC last time, and it was a blast. And the song we played at the end was "Who Are You" by The Who, and it was just a lot of fun. And we're a band. That's it.
Yeah, and I'll throw in there that as uncool as a identity-centric cover band may sound, you guys kick some arse. I mean, I've seen you play, and
thank really you, good. Sir.
Thanks.
I can say we had a good time. We always have a good time.
You can actually find videos on YouTube of you guys performing. So if you're not familiar, if you haven't seen them at a conference, are you guys going to do anything virtually this year since conferences aren't happening?
People were asking us to do some things, and we toyed with the idea of doing a virtual recording, and it sort of didn't take off, but maybe we'll have to do something. I surely miss it.
Okay. All right. Well, Jim and I certainly appreciate your time today. I think we covered just a lot of ground with just learning more about background, UMA, and why we both think blockchain is not the next big thing. The Consumer Identity Breach Report. I'll be sure to put a link to that report in the show notes for people who are listening, so that way they've got an easy way to get to it. And, I think with that, are there any last notes or comments that you want to throw out there for us, Eve?
The breach report is a great resource. I hope people check it out. Also, I was mentioning the ForgeRock ROI calculator. There's actually several calculators, and people might want to check that out. And I just had a great time chatting with you guys. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, this was a great conversation. I certainly appreciate it. And I think with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up and leave it there for this week. And thank everyone for listening. If they've got questions or comments, you can always email us at questions@identityatthecenter.com, or feel free to look us up on LinkedIn and shoot us a message there. And we'll go ahead and leave it there for this week. Appreciate it. And thanks for listening. Take care, all. You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. For more episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.